Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 381 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and I'm joined today by Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
This is a special bonus episode that we recorded to thank our patrons at patreon.com/StarQuest for their generosity in making this and all our shows at StarQuest possible. We gave them early, exclusive access, but now we're sharing it with you to show you one of the benefits of being a patron. So please enjoy the show. But Jimmy, today's episode is a little different from our usual Patrons Questions episodes. So what should we know about today's?
Today's episode is one that we recorded on our recent Mysterious World pilgrimage to Italy. It's one of two episodes that we recorded in hotels that we were staying at, and I never like letting material go to waste. So the plan is to use both recordings of these two sessions as our next two Patrons Questions episodes. Today, plus the next one, which will have its public release in December, will be based on those recordings. After that, we'll be back to soliciting questions from patrons on Patreon. But I wanted to give the patrons who went with us to Italy a chance to have their questions shine.
We saw some really amazing things in Italy, and that had an impact on the questions that the patrons asked in this episode. So what should people know who weren't able to join us in Italy with this time?
The most important impact that what we saw on the trip had on this Ask Me Anything session was what the patrons saw at the Capuchin Crypt in Rome. This is a church that was founded by the Capuchin order in the 1600s, and it's based on a previous monastery they had going back to the 1500s. One of the unique things about this church is that the Capuchins used the bones of around 3,600 of the monks who had lived in the monastery between the 1500s and 1870 to build artwork in a series of chambers. As a result of the artwork, it's also known as the Bone Church or the Bone Crypt. For example, in these chambers, you'll be walking along and then you'll see things like, oh, here is a chandelier made out of human bones. The purpose of this artwork was to serve as a memento mori, or a reminder of death. In other words, we're all going to die, so you should live in a way to ensure a good afterlife. I got footage of these chambers while we were there, and I hope to use it in a future episode of Mysterious World. This is one of several future episodes I'm planning on making to explore some of the mysteries that we looked at in Italy, so everyone can learn about them, including people who weren't able to join us. But as you can imagine, the patrons who were able to accompany us this time had multiple questions about what we'd seen, so I dealt with these questions before proceeding to other questions that the patrons also asked. Afterward, we had several reminders of the Bone Chapel. I actually got a couple of t-shirts from it. It had a gift shop, and they had Bone Chapel designs. The patrons on our second bus also gave me a present, which was a cigarette lighter that had bone designs on it from the gift shop, which I thought was a rather ironic way of reminding one of death if one is given a gift of a cigarette lighter. Although I'm a pipe smoker and we have a very different risk ratio than cigarette smokers.
Is there anything else we should know about the episode?
Yes, towards the end of this first session, we had a battery problem with the camera, but one of the patrons who was with us, Patrick Sweeney, was able to help us out with additional footage of the session, including the end of it. So in today's episode, if you're watching the video version, you'll notice a jump and a difference in the footage towards the end of the episode. But I really want to thank Patrick Sweeney for helping us out in a pinch. So thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. So, Jimmy, what kind of questions are we going to be answering today?
We're going to be talking about things like, what's the most amazing thing you've seen on the trip thus far? Why does the Catholic Church allow the creation of art using human remains? What if a non-Catholic relative wants to be cremated? Why can't we use our remains the way these monks did? Why shouldn't we scatter the remains of the dead? Why are Italians so thin? Will the canonization of Blessed Carlo Acutis result in seeing relics of video game consoles? Is there a parallel to terminal lucidity at the beginning of life? What patron saints do you and I have that might surprise people? How do we know that there are only three persons in the Godhead? Are we living in a simulation? How to tell true gelato from false ice cream? Do the words of Jesus tell us anything about the kind of bread he used at the Last Supper? Where would I take listeners if unencumbered by space and time? What are some of my most surprising episodes, and more?
Very good. And so let's get to the footage and listen to all those questions and answers.
Okay, so welcome, folks, and we've got your questions, and we're going to go through them now. As I mentioned, I've prioritized those that dealt with the Capuchin ossuary, and then after that, we're going to go in chronological order of the order in which the questions were submitted, and then people who asked more than one question, because we want to answer as many as we can, we moved the duplicate or extra questions to the end, and any that we don't deal with tonight, we'll deal with on the very next episode of patrons' questions on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And I want to thank you all for coming on this pilgrimage with us to Italy and for your support of the program. So give yourselves a big hand. So thank you so much to y'all and to all the folks who make Mysterious World possible.
I should note this distinction of this show is that it is both the first live recording with a studio audience and the first recording
that we have done. I'm sure CBS has done it before.
Yes. And the first live recording with us together. So this is fantastic. So let's get right into the questions. Kayla has asked this question. My question for you is, what has been the most unique and mysterious thing you've seen on the pilgrimage so far?
Well, just speaking for myself, which is, I guess, I assume what she's asking, if there are many striking things that we've seen, some of them I've seen before, because I've been to Rome before and I've seen a lot of the churches and some of the amazing art and architecture in them. But in terms of something that's unique and mysterious, there have been two particularly mysterious things that we've seen thus far. One was the Purgatory Museum, and the other was the Capuchin ossuary, where we went through those chambers where they had all this artwork built out of the bones of monks who lived there previously. In terms of they're both mysterious. In terms of what's the most unique, though, I would have to say it's the Capuchin ossuary. It's more visually impressive, so it's unique in that sense. The purgatory experiences are also unique, but they're scattered in different places. Now, there are other ossuaries like the one we saw, but given what we've seen, I would probably have to give number one slot to the Capuchin ossuary. And for people watching this later on, we'll include some footage of what that ossuary is like.
I would agree. That was the most unique. Suzanne asks, after going to the ossuary, I'm curious why the Catholic Church allows this form of art using human remains, but at the same time requires that the human remains are kept together after death. For example, you're not allowed to spread ashes after cremation.
Okay, so in this case, the remains are kept together. Now, they may be intermingled, where you may have a piece of artwork that uses, part of someone's spine and part of someone else's spine and things like that. But they're all together in one place. And actually, that's allowed when it comes to ashes. The Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith recently issued an instruction in which they said you actually can mingle ashes of people as long as you don't go just scatter them so they get lost. You could have an assuary where you combine the ashes of several different people as long as they're kept in one place and as long as you know who they were, so you're not losing their memory. Now, sometimes people's graves, the name gets lost and so forth, but what the church is trying to do is preserve the memory of people in a specific location so that other people like y'all can pray for them, so that you can make visits. So it's not really about keeping everything together like God is going to lose track of some of it at the resurrection if it's not all together. The reason it's kept together is it's for us, so that we can go there and pray for and remember the people who've gone before. And so since all of the bones of the monks are still there, they're in one place, they may be intermingled, but they're all still there. It's not like the monks decided, hey, let's take a day trip down to Assisi and go up on the top of the mountain and just throw all the bones off and forget about them. So they are in compliance with the spirit of even what the church is doing now and has now said can be applied to ashes.
Actually, that's a good question. Sorry.
All questions are good questions. Yeah. There are only bad answers.
That's right. Suzanne had a follow-up question. Mm-hmm. You may have answered it. What is the stance of the church if a non-Catholic relative requests that upon death they want to be cremated and have their remains spread? Can a Catholic participate in that?
Okay, so like I mentioned, there is, it's not like God is going to lose track of what he needs to put somebody back together at the resurrection. In fact, there's historically been a discussion of exactly what does God need at the resurrection to put somebody's body back together and have it be the same body. And even the ancients realized he didn't need that much, because we have a continual flow. Now, they didn't have the atomic theory of matter that we do, but they knew that we take in matter over the course of our lives and we lose matter over the course of our lives. And so, they were aware that we have a pretty high churn rate. That's a term from the publishing industry where you have new subscribers coming in and old subscribers leaving, and that's your churn rate. Well, our bodies have a churn rate where we gain new matter and lose new matter, and we go through a bunch of matter over the course of our lives. And we're not going to be ginormous, freaking huge, weird monsters at the resurrection. So God's going to pick some matter and use it to build our bodies back. Exactly what that is, we're leaving up to God. And it's even been pointed out recently under the auspices of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith that it's not a teaching of the faith that it's going to be the same matter, but it's going to be the same body, informed by our soul, and it is likely to include some of the same matter, just like Jesus's glorified body did. When he rose from the tomb, there wasn't a bunch of matter left in the tomb that had been his body. So the issue of keeping it all together is not necessary from God's point of view. And that means it's not strictly necessary from man's point of view. For Catholics, our custom is to keep it together so that we can pay visits and remember and pray for people. But that's for us. That's not for God. And that's the Catholic custom, and that's the law in the Catholic Church. Now, if you have a non-Catholic relative, they are not part of the Catholic Church. They are not bound by the Church's law. And so they don't have to keep their remains all in one spot. And therefore, they're not doing anything illegal under church law, which they're not subject to since they're not Catholic. And they're not doing anything illegal under divine law since God doesn't need all their body kept together. And so I would say if a non-Catholic relative wants to be cremated and have their ashes scattered as some kind of meaningful symbol to them, I would say Catholic moral theology does not prevent that. They don't seem to be doing anything intrinsically wrong. They're just not following the Catholic custom. And therefore, I wouldn't see a problem with someone honoring the wishes of their relative or even attending and participating in the scattering ceremony. It's not what we do, but it's okay for others to do.
Karen asks, seeing the Bone Church may have been my highlight amid all the incredible experiences so far. In case no one has asked, why was this an acceptable use of remains for the monks, but not a current option for those who pass away?
Who says it's not a currently acceptable option for those who pass away? Now, the Capuchin ossuary that we saw contains bones of monks that were served in the monastery and lived there up to 1870. But there are other, and then the Capuchin monastery chose to discontinue the practice. But canon law does not contain a restriction on you can't make an ossuary. In fact, there are other churches that have ossuaries elsewhere in the Catholic world. And as far as I know, some of them may still be active. They may still have new people, they're typically at monasteries, but they may have new people being added to them. In any event, I'm not aware of any prohibition on anyone doing the same kind of thing today. Now, everything in a diocese is subject to the authority of the local bishop. So if you wanted to do an ossuary-like structure today, you'd need to get the bishop's permission. And some bishops in some parts of the world, I'm sure, would say, yeah, I don't think that's a really for us today thing. Especially given media. Can you imagine? Bishop approves artwork from parishioner bones. But there may be situations, particularly pre-existent ones, where there's been an ossuary for centuries that a bishop today might allow such a thing to continue.
Gerard Mikola asks, I just wanted to know why they removed the bones from where they'd been buried and resting in peace. I know many had a really rough time in life, even violent, so why remove them from their original resting place? The displays were very disturbing. My question's not complicated. I just want to know why. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I agree. The displays do have a disturbing aspect to them. That's the point, is we're all going to die, and this is what's known as a memento mori, which means remember death. This is where we're all headed. Now, by making these startling displays, it's trying to make us think about death and think about we're all going to go there, so live your life now to prepare well for the next life. And I think that the artistic aspects of it are meant to help us see beauty even in death. And so it's arresting when you first see them, but I think that there are noble motives involved. In terms of why they moved, I think that it has to do with sort of the monastic mindset. There's a Benedictine abbey in Southern California called Prince of Peace Abbey. And I've been there multiple times. Once when I was there, the abbot was given a tour, and he was leading us around the grounds, and he points to a specific spot and says, this is where I'm going to be buried. Because when they join the monastery, they're effectively joining a new family. They're not going to go back and get buried in their own family's plots, wherever their family may have a burial plot. They're going to get buried on monastery grounds and be part of the monastic community or monastic family even after their deaths. And the later monks are going to remember them and pray for them and so forth. And so what happened in this case is this group of Capuchins had an original monastery going back to 1528. But then in 1631, so just over a century later, they needed to relocate to their current location. And they decided, well, if we're going to have to move the monastery, we're taking our brothers, our spiritual family members, with us. We're not just going to leave them behind and forget about them and not pray for them and remember them. And so they decided that they would disinter the bodies of their brothers and bring them to the new location where they created the ossuary chambers. And they continued to add new ones, as I mentioned, until 1870. But basically, it was keeping the family together. That's why they moved them. And, you know, the people are, if they're already in heaven or if they're on their way to heaven, they already have fundamental peace in the afterlife. So it's not like you're really disturbing somebody by moving their remains. They're not tied to their bodies in a way that it would disturb them to have a translation from one place to another like that. And it was a way to keep them in the monastic family.
Thomas Bruner asks, my understanding is that as Catholics, we are not supposed to scatter the remains of the deceased. In light of this, I've always wondered, why is it permissible that we separate body parts of the saints and send them to different places as relics?
Okay, so the principle, as I mentioned, is we want to remember people. And that's why we don't scatter ashes, because they're not in a place where people can remember the lost loved one, or you could pray for them anywhere, but it harms the ability to remember the person if you don't even know where they are. And you tend to forget about them. If you got a grave marker, so-and-so is buried here. Even if I've never heard of so-and-so, if I'm visiting this grave, I can see that grave marker and pray for that person. And so having known locations that are marked is a big help. Well, okay, but what happens with saint relics? In the case of saint relics, we know about them. We preserve the memory of the saint, and we don't forget about them. And they're put in reliquaries, and people, venerate the memory of the saint. So the fundamental condition applies in both cases. It's a way of not just scattering the stuff, but keeping it in one place. Let me modify that. It doesn't have to be one place. There's a difference between scattering stuff and having them all in one place. There's also a middle position of having them in multiple places that are marked and known. And technically, you could do that with someone's ashes. You could hypothetically, divide someone's ashes, and they're really not ashes, by the way, because the flesh burns up. That's what the smoke is in a crematorium. What's left, what the ashes or cremains, to use the technical term, is really crushed bone, because the bone does not burn. And so they grind it up, and that's what the cremated remains or cremains are. But calling them ashes, because everyone does, so why not? It's not going to change anything if I were to get persnickety. Let's say you put them in 3 different containers, but then you put them in 3 different locations where it's marked, and this is so-and-so, this is so-and-so, this is so-and-so, so people could go there and remember them and pray for them. That would be okay. That would be permissible. And that's essentially what's happening with the saints' relics. They're being placed in multiple locations, but the memory of the person is being preserved, so they're not being lost.
Patrick Sweeney asks, I've been eating Italian food for a few days. How do Italians stay so skinny?
Okay, now that we've been here a few extra days since this question was asked, you may have noticed they're not all skinny. I've seen some grandmothers, and some of the Italian nonnas are not skinny. I've even seen a woman who was speaking Italian driving along on one of those, mobility assist chairs. So they're not all skinny, but for those that are skinny, here are some of the differences that allow that to happen. The first one is they don't eat as frequently as Americans. Now, in America, beginning a number of years ago, a very bad piece of diet advice started to be given, which was to adopt a strategy known as grazing. The grazing strategy holds that you should eat 6 or more small meals per day. Now, the idea was if you eat many smaller meals, then you're not going to have big meals where you just pig out and eat too much food. So sounds good in principle, but as always, we've got to test it and see what actually happens. And what actually happens is people eat more food that way. Also, because they don't just have a small meal of like 100 calories 6 times a day. They have larger ones than that, and the total number of calories goes up. But that's not the whole problem, because when we eat calories, our blood sugar goes up as our body converts the calories, whether it's from carbohydrates or fat or protein. It converts the calories into blood sugar, glucose, and that goes out into our blood veins, and our blood sugar rises. Problem is, humans have to have their blood sugar in a pretty narrow range, or it starts to cause damage to the body. And so what happens is, to pull the blood sugar, the excess blood sugar out of the blood, the body releases insulin. And that takes the blood sugar and puts it into long-term storage in our fat cells. Okay, and so what happens if you adopt a graze-in strategy where you're eating basically all day? Well, you're going to have a constant influx of calories, and that constant influx of calories is constantly going to be raising your blood sugar, and that constant raising of your blood sugar is going to lead to constant release of insulin. And that insulin signal is saying, store this extra blood sugar in your fat hormone, in your fat cells. And as a result, you're constantly in storage mode. What you're not getting into is fat burning mode, where your body is going into those cells to pull out energy, which is what the function of fat cells is to store energy for the future. Well, if you're constantly releasing insulin, telling you, you're also going to get diabetes, which is where your body stops being sensitive to insulin, or you stop making it even. But if you're constantly sending out that insulin signal that says store, 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 then you're never going to get into the burn, 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 burn mode. And so if you want to lose weight, you've got to eat less frequently in order to not have those constant blood sugar and insulin spikes. Well, Italians eat less frequently than Americans. They don't graze. They eat fewer snacks than we do. They do eat 3 meals, but they eat fewer snacks than we do. And when they do eat snacks, they're smaller than what we eat. So that's part of it. They also, even though some of what they eat is processed, a lot of what they eat is less processed than what we do. And that means that it has more fiber and it's less calorie dense. And so when they're eating vegetables and fish and all kinds of stuff, as opposed to, here's some ground up wheat that has been extruded into various shapes. They do have the ground up wheat that's been extruded into various shapes. That's pasta and pizza, but that's not all they eat. They eat lots of other stuff, and it tends to be less processed than what Americans eat. So that's another thing that helps them stay skinny, is less processed foods. They also have active lifestyles compared to Americans. Now, I don't want to oversell this one, because in America, there was this eat less, move more dieting advice, which will not work for many people, because it's not the whole picture. It's not just eat less. You need to eat less often in order to start burning fat. It not just decrease the quantity you're eating. That'll just make you hungry. You need to space out the eating. And even though being physically active helps, it is not going to make you lose weight much. It does have benefits to health, but weight loss is not a primary benefit of exercise. It at best plays a marginal role. So Italians who are more physically active than Americans get a little bit of benefit in staying skinny from the greater physical activity, but it's not a large amount. So that's a secondary factor. The big factor for those Italians who are skinny, why do they stay skinny, is portion control. In America, we have ginormous portions, and Italians typically eat much less than we do. And don't judge what they're feeding us as tourists as ordinary Italian portion sizes. They are not. I went to, when we were in Rome, I went to that restaurant right across the street. And one day I said, okay, I'd like to order for dinner. And now, normally I don't eat breakfast. I don't eat lunch. I eat one meal a day, which is my dinner. And I'm varying from that a little bit because, has an aspect of vacation on it. But I went to that restaurant and said I wanted a pizza, and they made a pizza that was, a foot long by 9 inches wide or something. And that was a lot for me to eat. But okay, I didn't want to waste food. That's what my mama taught me, so I ate it. So then the next day for lunch, I want to go back and I just want a piece of pizza. I don't want the whole thing. And I said, can you just sell me a slice of pizza? And they said, no. But they said, we can make it a circle and it'll be a circular pizza instead of the square one like they made last night, and it'll be smaller. I said, okay, make me that. They made me a circle with the same area as the, as the rectangular pizza. I guess geometry is not necessarily a big subject in Italy. But then, like today here in Assisi, I was walking around and I decided to eat lunch because I'd skipped breakfast, and I decided I'll have a small lunch. And I got 2 pieces of pizza, just because I might have only gotten one, but I wanted to get the regular, real kind of pizza. Now, they served us pizza at a fancy restaurant, which is not what you get in the neighborhood pizzeria. In the neighborhood pizzerias, you get it was good at the fancy restaurant, but in the neighborhood pizzerias, you get all kinds of weird stuff. And I've been to Italy before. I've had the weird Italian pizza. And so just for memory's sake, I wanted to have a couple of flavors of the weird pizza. So I got Parmesan tomato and arugula pizza, or as they call it here, rocket. So I had one piece of that, but then I wanted also another nostalgic Italian pizza flavor that I've had before from a previous visit, which is hot dog pizza. So I got my arugula tomato pizza and my hot dog pizza, just one slice of each, and that's what I had for lunch. So not a big lunch, and these are not huge, ginormous pieces. So I had that's what my lunch was, but my lunch, even being just 2 slices of pizza, was bigger than the Italians who were eating 2. They came in, they got 1 slice of pizza, and that was their lunch. And that could have been mine too, except I wanted to try both of those flavors. So portion control is the big reason, among the other factors that I mentioned, why those Italians who are skinny are skinny.
All right. Thomas Sanherho asks, since Blessed Carlo Acutis is to be canonized, will we actually see relics of video game consoles? And what about gamer tags of people who played with him online?
Okay, I think, and the difference between the 2 examples, I think, illustrates a principle that that is relevant here. So something is considered a relic if it was a personal possession of a saint. And so if future saint Carlo Acutis had a gaming console, that gaming console, well, it's a physical object that was owned by a saint, so it would be a relic. So yes, I think there, if his parents saved any, there would be video game consoles that would classify as relics. On the other hand, gamer tags, okay, that's different. Gamer tags, especially from people who played with him. Gamer tags is for those who may not be aware, they're essentially handles that you use when you're playing a game. They're like the names, non-real names that people use on Facebook or X or YouTube or whatever, or InstaSnap or whatever the big new thing is. But it's basically a pen name. And pen names are not physical objects. They are pieces of information, and they're duplicated in every instance where they occur. And so I think the relevant model here is not the physical object I think there is a parallel in the lives of saints to information that gets copied. So if you imagine, let's say, St. John Henry Newman, he was an author, right? He wrote, among other things, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, or the Apology for My Life. Okay, well, the original manuscript of that he owned before it was published, and may have even been written in his own hand, because I don't know how big he was on typewriters. And actually, he wrote that I'd have to check and see if they even did have typewriters. Typewriters were just being introduced when Mark Twain was alive, and he actually bought one, and he hated it. And one of the reasons he hated it was everyone wanted to know, how did he like his new typewriter? And he had to keep explaining it to people. And so he wrote the publisher a nasty letter, the typewriter maker, a nasty letter telling them why he didn't like the typewriter and how on all the problems it caused him. But he was so famous that the typewriter maker decided to publish his letter anyway as an advertisement for their brand of typewriters. Well, okay, Mark Twain and John Henry Newman kind of were contemporaries. So I don't know. I'd have to check the years to see, could John Henry Newman have used a typewriter to write the Apologia Pro Vita Sua? Maybe, maybe not. Well, the physical copy of the manuscript that he owned, that would be a relic. But if you go to, Amazon today and order a duplicate of Apologia Pro Vita Sua, that's not a relic. That's a copy of something that one instance of was a relic. If you download Apologia Pro Vita Sua for your Kindle or whatever, that's just information that has been copied. And so gamer tags, I would put in that category. It's anything that gets copied and is stored in multiple places, like on different servers and stuff. Even if it's Carlos Acutis' own gamer tag, it's stored on multiple servers, and so I would say it's not a relic in the church's traditional understanding.
Mary Cunejo asks, St. Peter was buried without his feet.
Mm-hmm.
Was it the standard practice upon execution by crucifixion to cut off the feet rather than pull out the nails? If so, why was this not done to Jesus?
I don't know that there was a standard practice. Crucifixion was actually done in multiple different ways. Sometimes they tied the arms, sometimes they nailed the arms, sometimes they nailed the feet, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they put the cross in weird positions, sometimes it was just a stake. So there were a lot of different varieties of crucifixion, and I don't know that there was a standard practice. I would, therefore, given the absence of knowing about a standard practice, I would say that we just have to look at each case and say, what does the evidence tell us about this case? Well, given that we have good evidence that the bones that we have are Peter's bones, and they didn't contain any feet, I would say it's a plausible conjecture that the feet were not returned to the Christian community when St. Peter was removed from the cross. So they may have cut off the feet, and who knows what they did with the cross. On the other hand, Jesus is walking around after the resurrection. So I think we can assume that his feet were not detached from his body. Either that or they regrew miraculously, which actually can happen if you've heard the Miracle of Calanda episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. But I would simply assume that because the community dynamics were different with the disciples and Joseph of Arimathea, one in the body of Jesus, that they were able to take the time. And we only know of 3 guys being crucified. It's not like there's 40 and we've got to get them all down tonight, which could have easily been the case when Peter was crucified. They, between the time involved, the small number of people involved, and the prominence of the local member of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, and given the fact that Jesus is not hopping around on stumps, I would assume that they did let Jesus's feet stay with his legs.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Father Robert Spitzer and the Magis Center's new Critical Catholic Cosmology program. Join a community of adults and educators seeking to grapple with the truth claims of science, philosophy, and the Bible in a classroom environment, with special appearances by Father Spitzer. Ground your faith in evidence with a critical method that integrates heart and mind. Earn 6 graduate credits over 2 semesters at a third of the cost of most graduate programs. Online or in person in the Boston area on Tuesdays beginning October 7th. Go to magiscenter.com/institute. MAGISCENTER. CENTER.com/institute, or search Critical Catholic Cosmology to register today. Russ asks, we currently have a significant amount of data about terminal lucidity. When do you think we'll see data regarding initial lucidity? Why do you think there's been a lack of research studying lucidity at the earliest stages of life?
Okay, so terminal lucidity, for people who may not be aware, is a sudden dramatic improvement in mental function that occurs shortly before death. And I did an episode of Mysterious World on it. I should have looked up the number, but you can find it easily. It occurs in people who have had long-standing dementia or long-standing Alzheimer's or, strokes and things like that. And then a few days or hours before they die, suddenly everything in their mind comes back online. And they become lucid, even if they have not been lucid for years. And it's terminal lucidity because it's at the end of life. So this is a mysterious phenomenon, and it has only begun to be studied in detail in the last few years. So if there's a parallel phenomena at the beginning of life, then it simply may not have had time to be studied. We know that there are situations where a form of sudden unexpected lucidity occurs earlier than death. It's called paradoxical lucidity, if I recall correctly. And that's also being studied too. But I'm not aware of anyone who's been studying a similar phenomenon at the beginning of life. Now, Russ linked an article that he had authored about proposed initial lucidity at the beginning of life. And he describes cases of like an abortionist more than one abortionist who is going to kill a second trimester child and suddenly experiences something from the child as the child's being killed. Okay, that sounds like a form of, I'm not sure that it involves lucidity, which is a sudden return of adult level mental function. I don't know that we have evidence here that the child has adult level mental function. I wouldn't dismiss the possibility. One of the theories about terminal lucidity is that it happens as the soul is becoming detached from the body. It means the mental function is not strictly dependent on what's going on in the body. And at the other end of life, you could think maybe the same kind of thing is happening. Maybe the soul, even though it's attached to the body, isn't fully embedded and immersed in it the way it will be during most of life. And then the body starts to the soul starts to loosen up again at the end of life. So I think it's an interesting proposal, but I don't see evidence for adult level mental function in unborn children. I don't know how you'd get that evidence. And so I don't know that I would call this initial lucidity. It does seem to me, though, that there is a possible anomalous phenomenon here that would fall under the broader category of anomalous cognition. And terminal lucidity is also a form of anomalous cognition. In this case, though, the anomalous cognition doesn't seem to be the sophistication of the cognition that the child is having, but the fact that it's apparently transferring to someone else. In other words, the anomalous cognition when someone is dismembering an unborn child is manifesting as telepathy. And so I wouldn't dismiss at all the idea that unborn children may display telepathy as a survival reflex or an alarm. If they're being dismembered by an abortionist, they may reach out, and just like it's natural to scream, when you're no matter what your age is, if someone's physically attacking you, it is natural to scream. And what that is an alert signal. Even if you're unaware of it, if you're a child and don't know how to talk, but you scream when you're hurting, and I guess some kids feel like they're hurting an awful lot. But it's a reflex that is an alert signal to other members of the community of, I'm in trouble, please somebody help me, even if you're not thinking about it. And so if you want to say that unborn children have a telepathic reflex when they're being attacked, and sometimes it's perceived, I got no problem with that. At the same time, if we're investigating this scientifically, we have to also consider other possibilities. And another possibility that I know a skeptic would propose is in the cases of the abortionists who had an experience when they were killing a child of feeling the child's pain. That could be, number one, it's a subjective experience. So we don't have independent eyewitness verification, the same way we can have independent eyewitness verification in cases of terminal lucidity, because it's not just one person who thinks they became lucid. The nurses saw them being lucid and the other family members. So we've got multiple independent witnesses in those cases. Here, it's just the abortionist. And in one of the cases, maybe also the abortionist's unborn child. Well, subjective experiences are hard to verify, and they can be explained as psychological phenomena. So a skeptic could propose that that what's really happening here is not a telepathic reflex on the part of the unborn child, but is instead the guilty conscience of the abortionist manifested in feeling some of the pain that they're causing the unborn child. So it's an interesting proposal, and I'd love to be able to figure out more about exactly what's going on there, but those are the kind of considerations that would need to be brought to bear on the study of the subject.
Elijah and Mary Thompson ask, howdy, Jimmy and Dom. I would love to hear about a saint each of you have a devotion to that might surprise your listeners, and why or how you came to have a devotion to them.
Okay, I'll name two, and then you can answer. So the first one that I have a devotion to that I acquired was Abraham, and he's widely considered a saint in the New Testament, but people don't tend to think of him as much as a saint today. So to say, well, I have a devotion to Abraham, would potentially be surprising to people. The reason I have a devotion, or have had a devotion to Abraham, is I'm a widower. And my wife died over 30 years ago now. And wow, did that hurt. And it took me a long time to recover from that, especially because my mom then died just a few years later, very unexpectedly. She should have lived another 40 years. The women in her family live into their mid-90s or later. So it was very unexpected when my mom died, and that was just as I was starting to date again after the death of my wife, Renee. And so that just ripped open all those wounds. And so now I'm getting older. And by the time you're getting older and when you're recovered from all that grief, and you're looking for people who don't have super complicated marital histories in a Catholic context, there aren't so many options. But I really wanted to remarry. I mean, I wanted to be a Catholic father. I wanted to have a bunch of kids. I wanted to have a companion in my life. And so I thought, well, Abraham, he's a widower too. Because after his wife Sarah died, he got married to another woman named Keturah. Now, back in his day, it was a lot easier. You just go down, you find a plausible candidate, you go to her father, you pay the bride price, also known as the mohar in Hebrew, and you got yourself a new bride. Not so easy today, but at least Abraham knows the pain of being a widower. And so I have turned to Abraham, in that light. Unfortunately, it hadn't worked out, at least thus far, because even though I have no problem talking behind a microphone, when I'm around women in a romantic context, I get shy. And in fact, the reason I got married in the first place is my wife took the lead. So, but that would be one instance of a saint that I have a devotion to that might be surprising. Another is, and it's not the saint that's surprising, but the reason why, and it's Our Lady of Fatima. This was back in the 1990s. I was working at Catholic Answers, and one day I get an email that the subject line is "My heart is searching for God." And so I open the email, and it's from a woman who is from a non-Christian country. And it later would turn out to be a Muslim country. And she wanted to be anonymous, even though I could tell from her email exactly what her name was. She wanted to be anonymous, so we went with that. And she wanted to know, what is the Christian view of women? Now, I would later learn the reason she was interested in that question is because she'd seen it. She had come to the United States as a college student. In fact, she had come to the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, my campus, and we knew some of the same people. And she had seen Christians don't treat women like Muslims do. And that intrigued her about Christianity. And so we talked about that, and we became friends and so forth. But for security reasons, we decided that we would use a code name for her. And the code name we used was Fatima, because I knew about Our Lady of Fatima, not in detail, not the way I do now, but I knew a little bit about Our Lady of Fatima. And also Fatima, Portugal, where the Virgin Mary appeared, is named after the daughter of Muhammad, Fatima. So as a Muslim woman looking at Christianity, daughter of Muhammad, Our Lady of Fatima, it seemed to fit. And so we would use Fatima as her code name for years. And then we come up to 1999, and John Paul II decides to release the third secret of Fatima, and it's about a papal assassination attempt that happened in 1981. And they had kept this secret all this time. And so that really deepened my appreciation for, we'd also put my friend under the patronage of Our Lady of Fatima, but all of that really deepened my appreciation for Our Lady of Fatima. So I would say Abraham and Our Lady of Fatima. Dom?
Well, from my point of view, I don't know if this is surprising to anyone who knows me, but maybe for those of you who don't know me as well, I have a very large devotion to Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati. This goes back to...
Is it because of the hiking boots?
Yes. It's because of the cigars and the wine that he's pictured drinking with his friends. Actually, that's not entirely untrue, because... So back in the 94 roundabouts, I was a student at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and we had a presentation on campus by the Minister General of the Franciscan Third Order. We learned about all the different orders recently. So he was the Minister General of the Franciscan Third Order, whose miraculous healing was the second miracle necessary for the beatification. I keep getting ahead of myself. Beatification of Pier Giorgio. And so he talked about him. They had these boards on, with these pictures and descriptions and his words. And as a young man at the time, at school, I was just entranced by him, by this modern young man, which is, I can imagine how some young people today would see Carlo Acutis. And I was entranced by the idea of this young man who had friends, who struggled in school, who loved to go outdoors, who liked to smoke cigars and drink wine with his friends. And pipes, yes. My favorite pictures are the ones where he's on the mountaintop with the pipe. Some squeamish folks airbrush it out. As if there's something wrong with it.
History deniers.
Yes. Pipe deniers. So I created what I believe, and I'm pretty sure is, the first website devoted to Pier Giorgio Frassati on, if anyone remembers, AOL sites. I had an AOL account, and I created it. They had this thing where you could create a website. You got mail. I did. And I did get mail because I got contacted by his niece, Wanda Goranska, who saw the site and wanted to know about this American who had this devotion to her uncle, and we communicated, and eventually she sent me some relics and some other nice things. And so ever since, I've had a huge devotion, and I'm so excited to have him canonized this September 9th, along with Carlo Acutis, which I think is providence, because I think they should have been canonized together in the first place. But that's my opinion. So, per Giorgio Frassati.
Okay.
So the Elijah and Mary continued in their question. Also, how do we know exactly how many persons are in the Godhead? The Jews didn't know about the Trinity, and Jesus didn't reveal the Holy Spirit immediately. How did the church come to understand that God wouldn't reveal more persons in the future?
Okay, so I'll answer based on my current memory, because I don't have access to all the resources I've got at home that I would want to look this up in. But I'll give you three responses to this. The first is a theological response, which means it is not doctrine. There is a difference between theology, which is opinion based on God's revelation, and doctrine, which is church teaching. So the common theological opinion about why there are only three persons in the Trinity is that this is the argument that with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as the love between them, that's the minimum number that you need in order to have a complete relationship. You need two people in relationship, and then you need the relationship itself between them. Only because God is so much greater than we are, that relationship is itself a person who we call the Holy Spirit. So that's a theological answer. It's a matter of opinion, not church teaching. So let's turn to church teaching. This subject actually came up a number of centuries ago in the Middle Ages about could there be a fourth person in the Trinity? And the answer, when you read accounts of that, was no. But when I read the primary source documents, and this is what I wish I had access to at the moment, but I don't. When I read the primary source documents, there was a specific theory of who the fourth person might be that was being rejected. And my impression from the time was that they didn't phrase themselves in such a way and with an infallible level of authority that would preclude it being possible for there to be additional persons in the Trinity. What they were ruling out was one specific theory about who a fourth person would be. At least that's my memory. Like I said, I'd need to, and I did do some checking with the resources I have available, but they didn't have this in it. So I maybe can check when I get home and refresh my memory on all this, but that's my memory of where the doctrinal question stands. The third thing I would say is my own solution to this question. My own solution is what God has revealed to us is that he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He has not revealed to us anything beyond that about his own nature. Therefore, in this life, regardless of what else he hasn't told us about or might tell us about in the future, what he has told us is he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that should be enough for us. And therefore, I shouldn't worry about are there or could there be any more people. I should just stick with what God has told us.
All right. Ted Coville asks, are we living in a simulation?
We're not allowed to tell.
Can someone hit the reset on the AC in the simulation?
Okay, so for this one, you want to go back and listen to a very early episode of Mysterious World. It's episode 17, which was, and you'll hear just how primitive the show was back then compared to how it is now. But the fundamental answer is going to be the same. We don't have any evidence that's good that we're living in a simulation. It's really a metaphysical idea that's been proposed, but it's one that we don't have good evidence for. I'm not going to say no evidence, because almost every time someone says no evidence, they're wrong. But I would say, based on my understanding of the science, we do not have good convincing evidence for this. What we do have good convincing evidence for is the subjective experience of consciousness.
And it is, we all have that. At least I have it, and I assume all of you do, but that's an issue in philosophy known as the problem of other minds. But I'm willing to go with my intuition that all y'all have inner experiences and are not what are known in philosophy as philosophical zombies. Which is a philosophical zombie is something that acts exactly like a person, but has no actual inner experiences. Well, I assume I'm not living in the middle of a philosophical zombie apocalypse. And so if we all have the subjective experience of consciousness, then that means we're real. We are not just a simulation. We're real. Now, you could propose that our consciousnesses are hooked into a simulated world that's running on a computer somewhere in some other layer of reality. But if so what? Our minds are real. Our consciousnesses are real. And so if you want to propose that this table is really made out of data being stored on a data system somewhere, well, that's interesting, but it doesn't make much difference. It doesn't make much difference. All you're talking about at that point is the base layer of reality. It's like if I proposed this table is made out of the elements of air, earth, fire, and water. Okay, that's how Aristotle would have explained the table. Then after Einstein proved the existence of atoms in 1905, just 120 years ago, previous to that, a lot of scientists thought, yeah, they're a mathematical trick. They're not real. But now that we have the atomic theory of matter rather than the classical four elements, if you want to propose the table is made out of atoms, or technically subatomic particles arranged into atoms, or if you want to propose the table is made out of data, okay, that's all fine. You're just talking different ultimate theories of matter. So if you want to say there's a computer that's running the laws of nature and the operations that keep the data, in the arrangements it's in, fine. But that doesn't really make much difference because I know I'm real, cogito ergo sum, and cogito ergo y'all too. So they do have y'all in Latin, So I would say, even if you want to propose that this is a simulation, well, maybe the physical world is, but we have real consciousness, and frankly, we don't have good evidence for the physical world being a simulation.
The phrase, I assume I'm not living in a philosophical zombie apocalypse, would be a great t-shirt.
Yeah. It would sell really well in philosophy departments.
Probably, yes. Bill Burke asks, how can you tell by looking at the containers in the shops whether it's true gelato or something else? Rumors are that some of the displays are more like ice cream.
Okay, so the question is how to tell the difference by looking. But first, though, let's talk about the differences between ice cream and gelato, because even though they are both frozen desserts, they are not actually the same thing. There are several differences between them, and these are going to lead to clues that you can look for. One of the differences is that gelato has less milk fat, or I've also seen people call it butter fat, than ice cream does. So it has more milk, but not as a ratio. It has more of the other products of milk, but not as much milk fat. Whereas ice cream, it's the reverse. It has much more milk fat. The second thing that distinguishes gelato from ice cream is the churning. Ice cream is heavily churned. And what the churning does is it gets air into the ice cream. So ice cream has a lot more air in it, which makes it fluffier. Whereas gelato is not churned near as much, which is why it's more slippery and not as fluffy. Gelato is made with typically natural flavors, and it's the flavorants that give it the color. Ice cream is made with many more artificial flavors and with artificial colors. One of the results of these different processes is that the taste of gelato is more intense. Because, also I should mention, ice cream is chilled to a colder temperature, and gelato is chilled to a warmer temperature. The result of all of these different factors is that the flavors of gelato tend to be more intense than the flavors of ice cream. One reason for that is with ice cream, because of all that extra milk fat, it coats your tongue, and the coating of milk fat clogs up the taste receptors on your tongue so that the flavorings don't come through as well. And that's why the less milk fat in the gelato makes the flavors come through better, makes them more intense. But if you can't just come up and bend down and lick what's in the container to find out if it's gelato, what can you do visually? Well, one thing you can do is look for a sign that says gelato. But if you don't trust the sign because you've heard these rumors that it might be really ice cream in there, there are a few things you can look for. One of them you can look at is the texture, because like I said, ice cream, it's made with more fat and it's been churned a lot longer. So it has a much fluffier texture. So this may not work if no one's taken any scoops out of the container, but if someone has been scooping it out, you can look in the container and see, does the texture look like ice cream or look like gelato? If it's ice cream, it's going to be fluffier and stuff. If it's gelato, it's going to be smoother rather than fluffier. Also, you can look at the color, because ice cream, as I mentioned, has more artificial colors, whereas it tends to be more vivid. And whereas the natural flavors provide the colors. Now, some of them do have intense colors. Like you make strawberry gelato, it's going to be bright pink, but that's because strawberries are bright pink. They're not adding extra red dye and stuff to make it even pinker. A lot of gelato has very muted colors compared to ice cream. Like the other day I was in a gelateria, and I saw some pistachio gelato, and it was kind of green, like pistachios are green, but it wasn't bright, vivid green. And I know pistachio ice cream is going to be bright, vivid green because they want it to scream this thing. We want you to believe it's pistachios at you. Similarly, like my favorite so far, I haven't had gelato that much, but my favorite flavor of gelato so far is lemon. I love lemon. Well, if you can imagine lemon ice cream, not that we actually have it in America, but if you can imagine lemon ice cream, what color is it going to be?
Yellow.
And is it going to be dull yellow? No, it's going to be screamingly bright yellow. Well, lemon gelato is not. It's white. And so those are two of the visual clues that you can use, the texture and the color. And you can also look for a sign that says gelato.
I had some pistachio gelato today, and it was like eating pistachio nuts in frozen form. It was amazing. Really good. I want some gelato now. All right. Steve Sanderfoot says, I recently heard a claim that Jesus used leavened bread and not unleavened bread at the Last Supper. The argument was that the Greek word used in Scripture was kind of a generic word for bread and not a specific word for unleavened bread. When I looked it up, the answers I found referred to this argument as being more of an urban legend than proof based on the generic Greek word for bread. What's your take on this argument?
Well, I'll be frank. I think it's a bad argument. So the relevant words here are artos and azumos. Artos is the standard Greek word for bread. It has a very broad semantic meaning, semantic range. It's so broad, in fact, that it can just mean food. And the reason being that since the agricultural revolution that introduced the Neolithic period, bread has been the main source of calories in most cultures, at least in this part of the world. And so anything that you would eat would tend to just be something you ate along with bread. So people would use the word for bread to just mean food of any kind. So very broad. So artos has a very broad semantic range. Azumos has a much narrower semantic range. It does mean unleavened. Technically, it means unfermented, but it came to be used to mean unleavened. It's also used for the days of unleavened bread on the Jewish calendar. But just because one word is broad and the other is narrow, that doesn't mean if they overlap, that doesn't mean you can say, oh, this is a broad word and it doesn't specifically have the narrower meaning. Therefore, we can assume it's different. No, we can't. Because, Dom, when you go to Mass and the priest consecrates stuff, is that bread?
Yes.
But it doesn't say azymes.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, so even today, we call what's consecrated at Mass bread rather than azymes, which is the older English term for unleavened bread. So I think the argument fails on that ground. It's an invalid move linguistically to say that a broader meaning means it must be something different than the narrower meaning. But there's a second reason why this argument fails, and that is that all three of the synoptic gospels, which are the ones that mention the Eucharist at the Last Supper, say that the Last Supper occurred during the days of unleavened bread. And it uses the word azumos to describe those days. So Jews were required during the days of unleavened bread to get all the leaven out of their houses. They couldn't even have it on the shelf. What they would do is they would find a Gentile in the community and give the leaven to him for 8 days, so that when the days of unleavened bread are over, they can get their leaven back. But that's how it worked. And so Jesus, being an observant Jew, we should assume that he was following Jewish customs unless we have evidence that he wasn't. And since three of these gospels identify this as taking place during the days of unleavened bread, we should assume that this was unleavened bread.
All right. Ray Galantine asks, if you could instantly transport your group between sites and putting aside concerns about trying to coordinate time zones, what would the ultimate 2-day Jimmy Akin Mysterious World Tour look like?
Well, I need to think about it, but my first thought is I need a little bit more than the ability to teleport between time zones. The places I'd want to take people, I also need the ability to make sure they survive and that they're not legally prosecuted. So I would, in addition to the teleportation, I would want life support equipment. In addition to the teleporter, I would want life support equipment and something to put us out of phase with the normal universe so that we're not detectable by cameras and law enforcement and secret government agencies and stuff like that. But assuming we get all this technology to go on a tour, I would go among the places I would want to go. And I'm also going to assume I have a magical navigation device that I can specify the kind of thing I want, and it'll take us there. Area 51. The surface of Mars, so we can get a look at those alleged pyramids up close. The closest thing to Bigfoot. We can find out, is it just a brown bear or is it something else? The closest thing to aliens on Earth. The closest thing to an ongoing visible miracle. And I don't have to say closest here because I'm sure this is happening. Ongoing private revelation. Someone who's having ongoing private revelation that we could ask questions of. So those would be some of the places I would give in that kind of tour.
All right. Tim Sweeney asks, what are the most humorous, for your sense of humor, urban legends, however you interpret that term, that turned out to be mostly true or all true, and why were they so funny to you?
Well, I'll since he's left it up to me to interpret the, urban legend, I'm going to do my best with that. But It may not be exactly what he's after, but I'll do my best. Urban legends, by definition, are legends and aren't true. So I'm going to look at some of the most surprising things that you might think are urban legends that turned out not to be legends, but actually true. And so these are some of the strangest, but nevertheless true stories. And we've actually covered them on Mysterious World. So one that we covered was Gloria Ramirez, the toxic lady. A woman gets brought into a hospital. They inject her with an IV, and all of a sudden people are passing out from the release of a noxious gas. What's up with that? Okay, that's episode 155. Another situation like, and you can easily see how that might get passed around as an urban legend, but no, this was true. Similarly, Pauline Dakin and the Weird World. This was episodes 162 and 163. It's kind of hard to summarize, but this woman named Pauline Dakin in Canada as a child was introduced into kind of a witness protection program gone mad, and also known as the Weird World. And then most recently, the most recent one we did, Victim F, which was episode 277. And Victim F was about a woman who her boyfriend calls the police and claims that kidnappers dressed as frogmen broke into their house at night and kidnapped his girlfriend. They had laser beams, they had drugs that they injected him and the girlfriend with, and it was just this incredibly unbelievable story that turned out to be true and has a lot of twists along the way. So that would be that one.
If you haven't watched those, we're not going to spoil it for you. So you have to go and check those out for yourself and find out what really happened in all of them. Kathy Koenig asks two questions. The first one, so Eddie and Lorraine Warren, how credible are they?
Not at all. And I will be doing an episode on them in the future. Ed and Lorraine Warren were con men and criminals. For those who may not be aware, they portrayed themselves as this husband and wife duo of Ed is a demonologist and Lorraine is a psychic, specifically a psychic medium. And they would work various paranormal cases. They are not credible. And actually, some of what they were involved in was criminal activity.
All right. And the second part of the question, I thought exorcists were not supposed to be publicly known. Was there ever such a rule?
Not so far as I know. I've never come across that in reading about the history of exorcism. It is not mentioned in the 1614 rite of exorcism. It is not mentioned in the 1998 rite of exorcism, and it is not mentioned in canon law. So as far as I know, there's never been a requirement that the exorcist not be publicly known in a diocese. There is much more concern about the privacy of the energumen, of the possessed person. And so they don't want, it's like patient confidentiality in a medical setting. They don't want, if someone's been possessed, that can kind of ruin your reputation. And so they want to protect the privacy of the possessed person, but the exorcist can be publicly known as far as I'm aware.
All right. Joshua Rollins asks, my question is, why do the Swiss Guards specifically protect the Pope? And what's up with the funny uniforms?
Okay. So the Swiss Guard was founded in 1506, which was in the Renaissance. They were founded, even though they're from Switzerland, the Swiss Confederacy, they were founded to protect the Papal States, which the Pope had until 1870 when he lost them. But they continue to serve as kind of a bodyguard for the Pope, and they play other defense functions around Vatican City. They have ceremonial functions as kind of the ceremonial guards. There's also another non-ceremonial group of security at the Vatican, but they have the ceremonial functions, in which capacity they wear the fancy uniforms. the reason for the fancy uniforms is it's tradition that goes back to the Renaissance. That's what soldiers dressed like in the Renaissance, and they've just kept it up. It's kind of, fashion and religion. Religion is a conservative force. It changes slowly. That's why Amish dressed like ordinary people did in the 1600s. Or 1700s. So that's what they do for their ceremonial functions. They also have non-ceremonial functions where they function more as an elite tactical and intelligence service. And they put more emphasis on that since the assassination attempt on John Paul I in 1981. So the public face is the weird uniforms that are tradition. The private face is what they don't tell you about.
I have a friend who's a former Swiss Guard, so yeah. The uniforms were designed by Michelangelo, I've heard. Do you know if that's
that true? I don't know if that's
true. That's
true.
what I've heard, is they were designed by Michelangelo.
And we're going to do 2 more questions.
Okay. So
then we'll do all the others on the patron question show.
So if you haven't got your question answered yet, you will be answered. Will Stevens asks, if we took DNA from the Shroud of Turin and cloned Jesus, would he be divine, since every speck of Jesus is divine, or the Antichrist, since created by man without a soul?
Okay, well, if you took DNA from the Shroud of Turin and cloned it, you would, A, be committing a mortal sin, because human cloning is a mortal sin. But you might get a little Italian woman who kissed the Shroud of Turin hundreds of years ago. So
surprise!
You got to be careful what DNA you're collecting, and that's even assuming the shroud is authentic, which is a whole other kettle of fish that I'm not going to do on Mysterious World anytime soon, because the research is nightmarish. But assuming we had some of Jesus's DNA and you cloned it, what would you get? Maybe would you get Christ? Would you get the Antichrist? Surprisingly, that is a plot twist involved in the worst awesome Christian movie that I have ever seen. It is called Black Easter. And I watched it and reviewed it with Cameron Bertuzzi, and he's got our review on his channel, which is Capturing Christianity on YouTube. It is amazing. The movie is so bad, it is hilarious. But it also has creativity in it. It's kind of like Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is the worst awesome science fiction movie. Well, Black Easter is like that for Christian movies. I mean, lots of Christian movies are terrible, but this one has creative thought in it. You've got these time travelers who are going back into the past and they end up playing minor but key pivotal roles in the Gospels. Like this one guy he's an African American guy. He's kind of hip hop in his cultural affiliations, and he ends up being the angel that comforts Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. and Jesus is there praying in Aramaic, and the American guy knows what is going to happen to Jesus and wants to warn him. And so he comes up and starts talking to him in English. And at first Jesus is confused, but then there's this moment where it's implied Jesus gets this download and can suddenly understand English. And he starts explaining to Jesus what's going to happen to him. And he's like, how do you know this? I saw your movie. And well, technically it was a pirated copy, but you know. and so I won't spoil it, but someone does take some DNA from Jesus and try to use it in the future, and it's very interesting, and you can watch Black Easter for yourself. But to answer it for real, what you would get is Jesus's identical non-divine twin. He would not have divine powers because those are not resident in Jesus's DNA. His divine powers are resident in his godhood. It also wouldn't be the Antichrist, because the Antichrist we have no basis, I should say, for supposing that a genetic copy of Jesus would be the Antichrist. all of the evidence we have concerning a figure of the Antichrist would indicate that the Antichrist is some kind of world leader that rejects the coming of Jesus in the flesh.
The video.
Okay, well, I'll finish answering the question, but then we're going to go to dinner anyway. So I'll just finish answering this one question. But the I'll do the second real quick. The evidence we have concerning a future Antichrist is that it would seem to be a world leader that rejects the Christian faith, and that's not something that comes from your genes. So we wouldn't have any basis for proposing it to be the Antichrist. There might be some unusual qualities that a identical twin, a genetic copy of Jesus would have, but they wouldn't be divine powers. They might, if he had unfallen DNA, he might have an extra long lifespan. He might have extra psychic powers. He might have, or greater degrees of the preternatural gifts that may have originally been built into our DNA before the fall. Or he might not have those things, because we don't know to what extent he did live in a fallen world, and we don't know the extent to which, even though he was personally unfallen when it comes to sin, we don't know all the effects that fallenness produced on his body, because it did produce effects, like when he got crucified and died for us. Well, there could be other ways that that the fallen history of the world could have affected him physically. So that would just be pure speculation. And now, one last question to round out our session tonight.
Kathy gets to ask the last question. Are we forbidden from burning sage as a rite of exorcism?
Okay, so there are two rites of exorcism that are approved in the Latin Church. One is the 1614 rite, and one is the 1998 rite. Neither one of them mentions burning sage. There are records in the history of exorcism of people burning substances in order to try to expel the demon, as kind of like you create a bad stink and it drives the demon out. Josephus, the Jewish historian from the first century, talks about Jewish exorcists using such techniques. But Christians have used kind of, this is the best term I have for it at the moment, but sort of physical discomfort exorcisms, even if it's just the discomfort of a bad odor or the discomfort of a particularly holy odor, because sage is regarded by various Native American groups as a holy substance, kind of like frankincense and myrrh are in biblical culture, and they will even use sage as part of Catholic liturgies in some Native American communities. Its use is not provided for in the law concerning exorcism, so it's praeter legem, or apart from the law. But just because something's apart from the law doesn't mean it can't be used in all circumstances. What you couldn't do is use it, as far as I'm aware, is you couldn't use it in a major exorcism, because the rite for that is prescribed in the 1614 and the 1998 rites. But in minor exorcisms or deliverance prayers, as they're sometimes called, I don't see any reason you couldn't in that circumstance. At least, I'm not recommending it. I'm just not aware of any law that would prohibit it. And with that, thank you so much, everybody.
Now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. And this week's feedback is from our episode 374 on the Oakville Blobs. Our first feedback comes from John AL790 on YouTube, who writes, "What if it was some kind of odd natural cleansing of our ozone layer? Something like waste from all the garbage that we put into the air?"
Well, if that were the case, then we would expect to see the same thing happening elsewhere and on a regular basis. The Pacific Northwest in the United States is not the most polluted area in the United States, and if it was some kind of natural reaction to pollution in the atmosphere, you'd expect to see it happen in areas that are more heavily polluted, and you'd expect to see it happen in regularly.
And there'd be some type of scientific explanation for how such things could occur. Then Our next feedback comes from Carol Riley via email. Hello, I always watch your Mysterious World programs. The blobs episode was thoroughly researched, but one detail was missing. What happened to the blobs after they spent time on the ground or other surfaces? Did they evaporate, dry up, and blow away? Did they have to be buried? It's interesting that neither Wikipedia nor the newspaper articles mentioned it. Thanks.
Yeah, they didn't mention it, and neither did any of the other sources I consulted. So since I didn't have an answer to that question, I left it blank in the episode. I didn't try to theorize about what might have happened. I would suppose that they disappeared on their own. You know, there's no, if there had been some kind of organized cleanup effort to get rid of them, that would have been mentioned. So I would suppose that they disappeared on their own. In terms of how they disappeared, two possibilities occur to me, and I could have gone into this in the episode. I just didn't, since I didn't have a definitive answer. But one is they could have dissolved, because this is a place that gets a notable amount of rain, not as much as Fayetteville, Arkansas, but you know, some, and that could have broken down the blobs, at which point the remnants of them leached into the soil. Another possibility is the opposite of that. On dry days, they could have the water in them could have evaporated, lead into them shrinking away. Now, what you then expect to happen would be for the next rain to re-expand them. But by that point, they could have, you know, gotten underground or something like that. But I think the most probable explanation is that they dissolved, and the results of that dissolution led to them leaching into the ground.
All right. And then James Miller on Spotify writes, could the blobs have been an experiment that wasn't intended to be a biological/chemical weapon, but unfortunately made people sick? Maybe it was an experiment into doing the opposite of cloud seeding, an effort to reduce rain in an area that is at risk of flooding, or to reduce the severity of tropical storms. But these efforts were abandoned when people started getting ill or proven to not be an effective method to reduce precipitation amounts.
Well, it's possible. We don't know what it appears that this was an experiment of some kind. And so it could be any number of things that were that were the subject of the experiment, that they were testing for, different things like, can we reduce or increase rainfall or things like that. But the thing that I would ask is, what evidence do we have? And I would tend to say that the fact all these people got sick would suggest a biological warfare test of some kind. That doesn't prove it's a biological warfare test, but that would be my first line of interpretation, since that's the demonstrable effect we had.
And doing that type of test, you'd normally be transparent. We'd tell people.
Yeah, if this were just a rainfall, can we control rainfall test? Why all the secrecy about it?
Exactly.
Whereas if it's a biological warfare test, I would understand the secrecy about it.
Right. And then Alexander Chipotle on Spotify writes, would it be possible that the blobs were in some way radioactive? Some of the symptoms seem indicative of radiation poisoning, and I can't recall hearing about any radiation testing being done in the episode. That's always one cause of sickness I think of when hearing these stories, kind of like my version of It's Always Aliens, which is on my shirt today. It's always radiation.
Well, I don't have a way to rule this out, but I wouldn't suspect it myself. Not all of the symptoms that were reported were symptoms of radiation sickness, as far as I remember. I don't recall their hair falling out being one of the symptoms that was reported with the Oakville blobs. Also, I don't report people, having sunburn. Like the one officer, even though he had gloves on, he was scooping them off his windshield, and his hand didn't get sunburned and things like that. It didn't exhibit signs of radiation exposure. So I would tend, and also secondly, probably they would test for things like that as part of as part of the panel of tests they did, especially after samples were brought in to be examined once people started getting sick. So I would suspect that that would have been not the explanation in this case.
So that's it from us this time. Thank you to all of our patrons, and especially to the pilgrims who submitted these questions. You can submit feedback by going to patreon.com/StarQuest and leaving some feedback there. Send us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, or by calling our Mysterious Feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at patreon.com/StarQuest, and eventually at mysterious.fm/381 when we release this episode to all listeners. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to and supporting Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.